You are joking if you think that woman has any feelings for you. Utad was lying in his own tent, with his men beside him, discussing the evening. Finan, a little way from him, ankles folded and arms behind his head, stared up to the canvas, thinking. She stares at me when she thinks I'm not looking, Utad replied. I have seen her look away when I look at her. Means nothing, Finan replied. I'm telling ye. She may hate you as much as like you. He watched his friend turn to his other warriors. Are ye just a wee bit drunk, Lord? Utad ignored him and turned to his other warriors. Clapper, Citric, what do you think? The young warrior shrugged his shoulders as the older man grunted, having not heard the question. I cannot say, Lord, he replied, non-committally. Utad looked across to Osferth, who shook his head. She doesn't look like she likes you, Lord, not to me, anyway. She's almost annoying as you. Utad grumbled. So that's it, Finan asked. Because she shows no interest in ye, and she annoys ye, you want to wind her up? Well, Utad said, springing to his feet. I'm going to find out. What? Finan was roused from his state of quiet, easy contemplation at the outrageousness of his friend's suggestion. He sat up and peered at Utad. But, you have a wife, he accused. And besides, that just isn't very. He broke off as a huge grin spread across Utad's face and he got to his feet. Utad, she spent a long time being harassed by Ethwold, if you recall, Finan reminded his friend. Just a bit of fun, Finan, my old friend, come and watch. He clapped Finan on the back. I will do no such thing. Finan replied, hotly. Have you thought what could happen if you do that? What if what you say is true? You're coming, are you not, Citric? Osferth? Utad nodded his head towards Finan, and winked. Citric sheathed his seeks which he was polishing and got up too, ashamed that he had felt that Osferth might have usurped his position in Elfber's heart enough to watch her being annoyed by Utad. He also understood his lord's meaning when Finan folded his arms and looked annoyed. You too, baby monk? Finan looked at Osferth with disappointment. Aren't there rules about this sort of thing? Thou shalt not play tricks on people? Nothing that I've heard of, Osferth said, catching Utad's eye. Finan sighed deeply. I suppose someone with a bit of sense had better come with you, Lord, he added. That's if you can find her. 88,888,888. But Osferth was not where she had been, in the proximity of Ethlierd's tent. Because she had seen someone who she had made a promise to herself about, and was now following Father Boker across the field and to the larger tent that was being used as a church. He pushed the cloth to the church aside with one of his large hands as if swatting a particularly large insect. Behind him, Osferth stepped in after him and stood by the entrance, waiting for him to come out of his thoughts which were so clearly occupying him, enough for him to begin pacing at the anxiety in his mind. Osferth's heart lurched, for she remembered him doing this sometimes in Bibbenberg's chapel at times when her uncle Elfric had given him an ethically dubious task to do. May I confess, Father? Osferth asked, when he first noticed her standing there. Whatever his preoccupation had been, Boker smiled and nodded. Yes, my child, he said. Come, kneel beside the altar and I will hear you confession. Had Utad decided to search the for Osferth instead of being in amongst the people dining in a makeshift hall, he might have heard all his sister had to say, and their history might have been different. But he hadn't, and was now enjoying a second supper and ale with his warriors instead, and the conversation had gone from Ethlierd's newest guard to how many West Saxons would be alive at the end of the battle in Lundin compared to how many Mersons. Osferth trod gently towards the wooden table draped with a finely embroidered linen cloth. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, for her nerve was very fine. Then, as Boker began the first prayer, she opened hers again and looked at the priest, once Bibbenberg's priest, who had given her all the guidance, love and direction than she had ever had from anyone else. Did Elfric send you a message that I was dead? For a moment, Osferth thought he hadn't heard her. He had lifted his head and was looking at her, as if waiting for her to bow her head again. Then, Boker opened his mouth wide, as if searching for something to say. And then, not long ago I read ... I saw your name ... Edra? Osrith didn't respond immediately, for the name seemed from a place long ago and far away. Then she nodded, not caring that tears were easing their way down her cheeks. Edra. Oh my dear child. He made to put his arms around her, and did so softly, as if she might break. Congratulations, father, Osrith said, to steady her emotions. Your marriage? Oh, yes, that, Bilka said, dismissively, getting to his feet. Yes, we got married. He looked at her as if she were still a dream. But you? Osrith got up too. I escaped from my uncle, once I knew of my fate. She was a little gratified to see that he looked a little ashamed, for Osrith knew that Bilka knew of Elfric's intentions, and had left for Winchester in any case. But then Osrith dropped to her knees again. I need to confess, father, she said again. Will you take my confession? Bilka's eyes were shining, but he nodded and knelt beside Osrith. And confessed she did, starting with her theft of the boat and the silver from Bibbenberg, to her pride at her career in the Mercen army, and all of the things in between. She had been in the company of a Norseman, escaped from the betrothal of herself to Guthard, fornicated with the king of Alba's son. This did cause a good deal of blushing to go to Bilka's face when she recounted what she had done in his company. Osrith even told him of Tagged, who she had intended to marry, and live well, as a warrior. His eyes narrowed a good deal when she told him of her dealings with the Healer Britons, but Osrith did not elaborate on what she had bought from Beether and Bark, or its purpose. Edra, Bilka said at length, you have confided in me, and only God has the ability to forgive you. It must have taken a good deal of courage to come to me tonight. Do you repent all you have told me? Yes, father. Then, the Lord will forgive you for these sins. But tell me, Bilka got up again, and Osrith followed. You were not Edra when you came to sit in the palace chapel? When I left Bibbenberg, I chose a different name, the name of one of my ancestors, King Oswy's daughter Osrith. It was the truth, but now standing before Bilka, in the relative safety of the Mercen army, it sounded lame. Ah, Osrith, Bilka repeated, I do remember your name, and now, look at you, a fully grown woman, and a warrior, and no one to guide you. I'm 16, father, Osrith replied, earnestly, or at least, I think I am. And you're wrong. You have been by my side. I? Bilka looked very confused. But Osrith smiled, as she remembered her thrill each time she had found his small, neat handwriting. You sent letters to the monks living in the monastery at Caldes. I read them. You guided me to Utrecht, to Wessex. I read your letters, in Doyer, in Kells. You? Did all that? And then Bilka broke out into a huge smile, and put his arms out to Osrith, and she fell into them. It was so good to get her secrets off her chest. At length, Bilka stepped back and looked at her face. God had planned this. God saw to it that you knew where I was, Edra. Osrith is my name now, she reminded him. And are you baptized of it? Osrith shook her head. Then you must. Your mother made you to be rebaptized, Bilka told her. Osrith smiled. I know, you told me. Kfta you tell Utad. Oh child. It is so good to see you after all this time. But Osrith took a step back. She suspected Bilka would say this to her, to mention her brother, and she felt cold at the suggestion. But the priest was pressing on, and he was looking over her form. But, a warrior, Edra? The army is not a place for a woman. Why? Osrith asked. I have no fear, I never fear anything in battle, God has chosen this in me. It is better than being wed to Sven Kjartansson. Yes, it is. But Osrith shook her head, sadly. I will not be telling him. Bilka. I joined the Mercen Guard for a reason, to become a person in my own right. Besides, I have seen how he treats people, heard of his actions. He is a pagan. He is. He believes in God in his heart, Bilka replied, and Osrith thought, he truly believes that. I saw him, once, Osrith pressed on. He came to Bibbenberg with my uncle's man's head, and swore to avenge him. This was after you left, father, she added, and saw that Bika flinched again, at the mention of him leaving. So Brit, he left a boat in the sea gate. I escaped. Osrith rubbed her scar on her left hand. Sometimes she could still feel the pain of the arrow through it. And she told him of Dunnottar and Iona, of Doiaya, Kells, and Tara, and her Watchimga king make 2 kingdoms into one. Ethliad does not want that, Osrith concluded. He does not want to be subsumed like the Strathclydians, into one land under one king. Osrith stopped, because Bika was just staring at her. But I will be baptized with my new name, if you think it right. And she stopped talking, and waited for Bika's words. All this time, he mused quietly, then added, louder, I rarely see you in church. I do come, Osrith admitted. I think my faith is different. The church is different in Irian. Bika nodded his head. I was brought through the Irish church, he said, at the monastery in Melrose, where I was left. Osrith gasped. Abandoned by your parents? Yes, for whatever reason. And they tolerated the Irish monks there. They prayed a great deal. And took on a lot of trials. Come. He beckoned Osrith through to the section of the church at the back. Clearly a living space for him and Thyra. A bed was propped up with wood near the floor with furs laid nearly on it. At one side a trunk sat, with books near it, and a parchment was on top, as if the priest had been interrupted writing it. The Irish church, Bika mused, as he closed the trunk lid. I know a priest, a warrior, who would love to meet you, Osrith. Although, on second thoughts. His voice trailed off, and then he turned back to Osrith. Of course, you cannot remain in the army, Osrith, Bika said, quickly, his eyes darting from left to right. Then he looked at her. I can find you someone to marry, who will accept all you have done, as befitting a lady of Northumbria. But Osrith was on her feet and striding towards the church. Wait. Where are you going? Bika reached for her shoulder, and she turned. Osrith felt her heart beating in her chest. What did she expect? That Father Bika, her parent in all but the physical sense, would let her go on as she was? Anger flared in Osrith's chest, anger at herself. Returning to my duty, Osrith said, stiffly. But Bika had somehow put himself between Osrith and the exit. Does he know this? Does he know about you? When she said nothing, Bika added, you did? No. Then, he continued, but paused, then smiled and nodded. Our home is yours, while I make arrangements. But Osrith shook her head. I fear for you, after all you have told me. Bika shouted, and Bika shouting was enough to make Osrith turn quickly to him, fear of a little child in her chest, her heart beating. She had been scolded. Why? I have fought, I have killed ... I have killed Norse, I was beside Prince Domhnall, who is now King of Alba as he killed Ivar. But Bika was beside her, his face imploring, and Osrith felt her heart sink when he urged, Utad must know. Why? I have seen my brother, father, Osrith said, steadily. I know him through his actions, torn between lives, Saxon and Dane, Christian, and pagan. This will be the death of him or, if not him, others. He has a sister, a Danish adopted sister. Now my wife, he risked so much for her, Bika replied. But his first wife? Abandoned? Murder of the Britons of Cornwall. And his current wife is a pagan? Osrith shook her head. He is too conflicted, father, I would only add to his confusion. And it was at that point that Bika nodded, sadly. Ethliad is all I need, his army, that is. Then stay, Bika said, stay close by. Osrith ... Edra, he asked. Only if you accept I am no one's responsibility but my own, Osrith asked, and Bika nodded, before embracing her, as if he still didn't truly believe she was there. Osrith trod the moist earth back to Ethliad's tent, only to find that Miral had taken her place. Rest, and you can continue to guard the Lady Ethelfled tomorrow, Miral said. You may rest with your men, with Elfgar, should you wish. Osrith wished, pleased that her position had not been taken from her, and her heart lightened. How could Boko ever think that she would accept his making arrangements for marriage for her, or that he should think she should tell Utad that he was her brother, only for him to have the responsibility instead? Osrith was her own person, and would never accept a husband who would limit and control her. Like Ethelflaed's. Utad had indeed been drunk when he suggested that they find Osrith and annoy her, and after more drink, his men had got very tipsy very quickly, and he had left them in the large tent which was catering for the army to go to speak to Stipo about the next day's plan. So, he hadn't banked on seeing Osrith cross the fields in the dusklight, with a determined pace heading towards the army tents. It was an opportunity too good to miss against the stuck-up woman, and it was within seconds that he had pushed her towards the spinney of larch trees that formed a partial barrier between the army and the nobles. Seeks at her throat. Utad grinned at her outrage. "What are you doing here, girl?" he asked, trying to get her expression to register fear. But Osrith only looked at Utad in defiance. "I am no girl, I am a warrior." She spat back, and wriggled against him, to try to free herself from Utad's grip, but he held the blade tighter, watching fury enter her eyes as he trailed a hand over her chest. "A silver piece says you are," he murmured, ale on his breath, and Osrith struggled, for the most part, a useless gesture as Utad pressed his body against hers, watching for this action now to provoke her. What his alcohol-dulled senses did not expect, however, was Osrith swinging a punch, throwing all her weight behind it into his stomach while at the same time taking the wrist of his hand holding the blade and biting down with all her might. "Ah!" Utad screamed, the pain unexpected, and he reeled away from Osrith, only to turn back and give her a ferocious look. "Ah! My intention was not." He trailed off, shaking his hand again. "Do not look at me how you look at Ethelflaed." Osrith roared at him, though quite why she had chosen those words to throw at him. Clutching Bue's handle, she added, "Touch me again and it will be the last thing you do." She ducked as a punch came, and Utad was left massaging his hand as it had landed with force on bark, not her face. He was furious now, and made a grab for her, but Osrith pounced towards his legs, bringing him down. She was just about to land a hefty punch to his face when hands brought her to her feet. What is going on here? It was Bika, and he was having to hold her back with all his might to prevent Osrith from flying at Utad again. "Leave me!" she shouted, glowering at Utad, who was trying to get up from the ground. "I will have him. I could kill him." "You could not Utad." Bika's voice was soft, as if trying to soothe her, but his words only caused to volatilize her anger. I have killed Norse, Picts, and Gaels too. But not Utad," Bika continued, softly. "He will never be beaten." Osrith dragged herself from the priest's grip and drew Bue. "That threat only has to be proved wrong once." She shot back. Bika stood silently where he was, for Bue's tip looked sharp. Then a voice called behind them. "Bika? What is this?" The speaker neared them, then gasped when she saw her husband at sword point. "It's Osrith, my love," Bika replied, and stepped away as the woman stood between Bika and Osrith. "And she, Utad? She is showing how much she hates the bastard," Osrith thought, not taking her eyes off her brother. "I have no doubt there was a disagreement," Thyra Ragnar's daughter replied, her eyes looking at Osrith as Bika shooed Utad away. Utad got to his feet, determined not to be shooed, and saw Bika's face. He picked up his sword, and then with his chin in the air, stalked back off to his tent, with the nobles. Osrith stared at Thyra, who she had seen before, at Ethelflaed's wedding, and dropped her sword, pushing Bue back into her scabbard. "Hatred," the Danish woman whispered. "Hatred?" asked Bika. "My love. This is Osrith." But Thyra spoke again, her eyes willing Osrith never to look away. "I was imprisoned once, by a man named Sven," she began. "Sven one eye," uttered Osrith, while beside her, Bika tried to quieten his wife. But Thyra was unmoved. She looked at Osrith curiously. "How do you know?" But Osrith said nothing and Thyra decided to go on. "I had hatred enough, then, but I learned to let it go." Thyra looked in the direction that Utad had stalked. Osrith glanced at Bika, whose face shone red honesty and was having trouble believing Osrith felt such a way to Uhtred, his long-held image of them being happy together as siblings fast evaporating like mist under a sun's glare. But there was something in the softness of the Danish woman's voice, her wise voice, and Osrith knew then that it must have been she, Thyra, who had gone in place of herself to Sven to suffer hideously for so many years. It was all Osrith could do than to hug the woman and thank her for buying Osrith her own freedom with her captivity. "What wrong was it my brother did to you?" Thyra's voice was soft, beguiling, but Osrith still had her own will, and she chose silence. "Nothing whatever," Osrith replied, glancing at Thyra, nodding a thank you to her. "Indeed, nothing," Thyra confirmed, gleaning all she needed to know from Osrith's demeanor. "That you are safe, now, with Father Becker, is good," Osrith concluded, forcing calmness into her demeanor, as if their meeting was the other way round. "Wait," Becker called, as Osrith turned to go. She sighed, and turned back to him. "I am going to rejoin my men, or I will be on privy duty for 2 nights if I am late to my duty in the morning." And Osrith turned and went now, over to the army, scanning the different bands of men, focusing hard on where they were, as if their campfire told her instantly where they were. "Osrith!" Becker shouted. But she did not turn, not even once, missing Thyra's look of astonishment that Becker knew her. "I am gone to Mercia," Osrith thought, as she spotted a figure which very much looked like Elfrith. "And I should never return to Wessex." 88,888,888. And Elfka moved over, relinquishing his temporarily held position as captain of this band of men. All 5 of the men stood when they saw her, and she nodded to each of them. "Good to see you, Osrith." A voice came from behind her as she sat next to Elfka, looking at the stew, probably rabbit, for Elfkin was amazing at watching and trapping them. She turned and Elfrith passed her a chunk of grey bread. "You've come back to us then? You've murdered the Lady Ethelfled?" Osrith laughed, getting back to her feet and clapping her friend on the back. "It's good to see you," she exclaimed. "Are you keeping my men in order?" "He said if we don't work hard to be the best fighters in the Mercian army, he will feed us to the monsters in the river." Elfkin's eyes were wide open and Osrith smiled. "True," she replied, sinking back down again. "But that will never happen, Elfkin, will it?" The young boy shook his head. "I can disarm Oshir," he said, proudly. "Then, I'll put you right at the end so you can disarm all of the cowardly, stupefying Danes," Osrith replied, ruffling his hair. But Elfkin would not be fighting. He would be being left behind at the camp with the women. "So why are you back?" Elfka asked, as he spooned stew into a wooden bowl for her. "Can't abide rich food," Osrith replied. "Gets stuck in my throat." She shook her head. "No," she admitted, "I was dismissed for the night from the Lady Ethelfled's guard by the Lord Ethlied," she told them, "so, I came back for the night." And so the night progressed. Folkball told them a ghost story, about dead spirits walking the land. It was just a variation on most ghost stories, but they enjoyed his retelling, and Elfrith told them the age-old lay of Beowulf. Osrith, on her part, told them of the story of Oswald, king of the Northumbrians, slain in battle by the mighty King Penda, which was well received, as Elfkin fell asleep in his brother's arms. She awoke next morning at dawn and quickly shook Elfka awake, telling him that she was returning to her guard duty, and to take the men, when called, to Miral. Ethelfled looked as pale and withdrawn as she had looked the night before, but she got to her feet and had her maids make her ready. When she was dressed, she made to eat a little of the meat brought to her. Good, Osrith thought. She has the will to fight, to stand up for herself. And, she realized, the signs were unmistakable to Osrith as she stood guard, the rounding of the woman's stomach, her lethargy and sickness. But, when her maids had gone, she confided in Osrith that the Lord Ethlied has commanded that she see a priest the night before. As the lady told Osrith of the Bitter Waters ordeal, and how Uhtred had intervened on her behalf, and smashed old Helm in the face, Osrith was outraged. Yes, the woman was a spoiled girl underneath it all, but to put her through that? Yet, thought a voice in the back of Osrith's head. If she had nothing to be concerned about, this judgment ritual would have come to naught. For the most part, Osrith felt sorry for her, to be struck and raped by her husband. But this did not take away the cruelty she had inflicted on Edward, stealing his toys, pinching and scratching him when she thought no one was looking, at an age when she knew exactly what she was doing. When she heard the mercenary army ready on the fields behind them, armor clinking into position, commanders' voices organizing their positions, Osrith spoke to Ethelfled. "Lady," she said, and withdrew something which Osrith thought she would never have done, and she watched as Ethelfled gripped her sword with familiarity, and held her firmly. She showed her a few moves and she surprised her, although, Osrith thought later, she shouldn't have been surprised, for she had fought with Steepa's help. After a couple of days of guarding the lady, and several hours of tuition, Osrith was walking back to her men again, after being dismissed by Ethelred. Ethelfled looked brighter, Osrith thought, and maybe she would begin to stand up for herself. She made her way across the field to her army, but a hand was on her shoulder. Tagged seeks in hand, Osrith had the blade at the throat of the man who had accosted her and looked into the face of her commander. Plans had changed, Miral explained to her, a little sheepishly, as they strode towards Aldhelm, who had indeed suffered at someone's hand, and if Ethelfled was right, it was her brother's, to listen to the official version. "You are to lead your division on the raid on Lundin,"